There is something more dangerous than evil, and almost nobody talks about it. It destroys relationships, ruins opportunities, spreads chaos, and somehow still goes unnoticed until the damage is done. It is not hatred. It is not greed. It is not even malice. It is human stupidity. And the most disturbing part is this. The real danger is not just that it exists. It is that you keep underestimating how often it shapes your life. The project that collapsed. The friendship that turned toxic. The argument that made no sense. The person who created damage and walked away like nothing happened. What if the hidden force behind more pain than you realize is not wickedness, but unconsciousness? Always. Not sometimes. Not occasionally. Always. And if that idea makes you uncomfortable, it should. Because the moment you truly understand it, you begin to see the world differently. You begin to understand why so many things fall apart for no good reason, why trust gets broken so casually, why chaos appears in places where logic should have been enough to prevent it. For most of your life, you have probably been taught to believe that people act out of clear motives: greed, fear, ambition, jealousy, pride. And yes, many people do. But stupidity is different. That is what makes it so unsettling. A selfish person may harm you for a reason. A manipulative person may deceive you to gain something. A cruel person may wound you out of resentment. But a stupid person can damage your life, waste your time, destroy value, and create suffering without gaining anything at all. No benefit, no strategy, no real advantage, just destruction without purpose. And that is terrifying, because how do you defend yourself against something that does not even obey logic? That was the insight behind what Cipolla called the first law of human stupidity. He understood something that most people spend their entire lives refusing to accept. Stupidity is one of the most destructive forces in the world precisely because it is so underestimated. We keep assuming people will eventually act in their own interest, or at least recognize when they are causing harm. But many do not. Many cannot. And the more we refuse to see that, the more vulnerable we become. This is why some of the deepest pain in life comes not from enemies, but from people who simply do not understand the weight of what they do. The co-worker who ruins a project through carelessness. The friend who keeps repeating the same destructive behavior. The relative who turns every conversation into confusion. The stranger online who spreads nonsense with total confidence. The person who makes everything harder, heavier, messier, and somehow still believes they are the reasonable one. You have probably met someone like that. Maybe more than one. Maybe many. Someone who creates problems where there was peace. Someone who speaks with certainty about things they have never studied. Someone who damages what they could never build. Someone who turns every opportunity into drama, every disagreement into chaos, every solution into another problem. And what makes these encounters so exhausting is that they violate your expectations of how reality should work. You assume that if something is clearly harmful, people will stop doing it. You assume that if the consequences are obvious, someone will eventually wake up. You assume that calm explanation, evidence, patience, and good faith will solve the problem. But sometimes they do not. Sometimes none of that works, because you are not dealing with a misunderstanding. You are dealing with a lack of consciousness. That is the part nobody wants to admit, because once you admit it, you lose a certain innocence. You can no longer move through life assuming that reason will always be enough. You can no longer believe that every conflict can be solved if you just communicate better. You can no longer pretend that every person is equally available to truth, maturity, or self-awareness. And painful as that may be, it is also the beginning of wisdom. The truth is, human beings do not only suffer because of evil. We suffer because of shallowness, because of impulsiveness, because of ego mixed with ignorance, because of minds that react before they think, speak before they understand, destroy before they reflect. And if you have ever been deeply hurt by someone who seemed almost unaware of the damage they caused, then you already know exactly what this feels like. It feels confusing. It feels unfair. It feels surreal. Because part of you keeps trying to make sense of it. You search for some hidden motive, some deeper reason, some emotional explanation that will make the absurdity feel manageable. But often there is nothing elegant hiding underneath. No master plan, no dark genius, just a reckless mind creating consequences it is too limited to foresee. And maybe that is why this idea hits so hard. Because it breaks one of the most comforting illusions we carry, the illusion that chaos must be intelligent, that pain must at least have intention, that destruction must have design. But much of the damage in human life comes from something far more ordinary and far more dangerous: unconsciousness. Think about your own life for a moment. How many times have you entered a situation assuming the other person would act with at least a minimum level of reason? How many times have you thought, surely no one would do this because this hurts everyone involved? And yet someone did, not because they had a clever plan, but because they lacked the awareness to understand the impact of their actions. That realization changes you. It forces you to stop seeing the world as a place where every problem can be solved with more explanation. It teaches you that some people do not need more information. They need a level of self-awareness they do not yet have. And until you understand that, you will keep wasting energy trying to reach people who are not reachable in the way you hoped. But here is where this conversation becomes even more personal. Because the first law of human stupidity is not just about other people, it is also about us. That is what makes it so uncomfortable. It is easy to point outward. It is easy to identify foolishness in strangers, co-workers, family members, political figures, internet commentators, and people we already dislike. But it is much harder to ask, where does stupidity live in me? Where do I act impulsively? Where do I defend ideas I have not examined? Where do I confuse confidence with wisdom? Where do I speak just to protect my ego? Where do I repeat opinions without understanding them? Where do I create unnecessary pain simply because I was too proud, too distracted, too reactive, too unconscious to stop myself? Those questions are not pleasant, but they are powerful. Because the moment you stop treating stupidity as a flaw that only exists in others, you begin to grow. You begin to develop the one thing that protects you from becoming part of the problem: humility. And humility is not weakness. It is not insecurity. It is not silence. Humility is the willingness to question your own mind before judging the whole world. It is the discipline of pausing before reacting. It is the strength to admit, I may be wrong. I may not see the full picture. I may be contributing to the very chaos I claim to hate. That kind of honesty is rare, but it is life-changing. If this idea is already hitting something deep inside you, then stay with me, because what comes next may completely change the way you deal with people, conflict, and even yourself. And if you want more reflections like this, subscribe now, because this journey only gets deeper from here. The real transformation begins when you stop asking, why are people like this? And start asking, how do I stay conscious in a world full of unconscious behavior? That is a much more powerful question, because the moment you focus only on changing others, you become trapped, you become frustrated, bitter, drained. You spend your life trying to force clarity into minds that are not ready for it. But the moment you shift your attention toward your own awareness, something opens. You recover your power. This is where philosophy becomes practical. The Stoics understood that suffering multiplies when we demand control over what is not ours to control. You cannot stop every foolish person from being foolish. You cannot educate every arrogant mind. You cannot reason every reactive person into maturity. But you can choose how much access they have to your peace. You can choose how much of your energy will be wasted on battles that were never going to produce wisdom. That is not cynicism. That is discernment. And discernment may be one of the most underrated forms of intelligence in the modern world, because we live in a culture that constantly encourages reaction. Respond immediately. Defend yourself instantly. Share your opinion on everything. Fight every battle. Correct every person. Prove your point. Win the argument. Be louder. Be faster. Be sharper. But wisdom often looks like the opposite. Sometimes wisdom is silence. Sometimes wisdom is walking away. Sometimes wisdom is recognizing that not every person deserves access to your inner world. Sometimes wisdom is realizing that your peace is worth more than your need to be understood by someone committed to misunderstanding you. That is a difficult lesson, especially if you are a thoughtful person, especially if you are someone who values truth, depth, and communication. Because your instinct is often to explain more clearly, love more patiently, give one more chance, offer one more insight, make one more effort. And sometimes that is beautiful, sometimes that is noble, but sometimes it is also self-betrayal. Not every situation is asking for your compassion in the form of closeness. Some situations are asking for your compassion in the form of boundaries. That matters. Because one of the biggest mistakes good people make is assuming that kindness means endless access. It does not. Kindness without discernment becomes self-destruction. Compassion without boundaries becomes exhaustion. Love without clarity becomes permission for chaos. You are allowed to protect yourself. You are allowed to say no without explaining it 10 times. You are allowed to step back from people who consistently create confusion. You are allowed to stop trying to save those who refuse to examine themselves. You are allowed to preserve your peace without feeling guilty for it. And maybe this is the deeper lesson hidden inside all of this. Maturity is not just learning how to deal with the stupidity of others. It is learning how not to surrender your soul to it. Because constant exposure to foolishness can deform you if you are not careful. It can make you cynical, harsh, dismissive, cold. It can tempt you to reduce everyone to their worst traits. It can make you lose your softness, your patience, your faith in the possibility of growth. And that is one of the greatest dangers of all. Because then, the stupid do not just create damage around you. They begin to shape who you become. So the challenge is not merely to identify stupidity. The challenge is to stay awake around it, to remain thoughtful in the presence of carelessness, to remain grounded in the presence of chaos, to remain deep in a world addicted to superficial reactions. That is the real work, and psychology confirms this in a profound way. So much of human behavior is driven by invisible patterns: insecurity, emotional wounds, defense mechanisms, projection, shame, fear of insignificance. People often do not act from truth. They act from pain they have never examined. They attack because they feel small. They interrupt because they feel invisible. They dominate because they feel powerless. They pretend certainty because doubt terrifies them. Understanding that will not excuse harmful behavior, but it will free you from personalizing everything. Not every insult is a true judgment of your worth. Not every rejection is a valid measurement of your value. Not every act of sabotage is a sign that you failed. Sometimes it is simply evidence that the other person lacks the inner order required to do better. That realization can save you years of self-doubt. Instead of asking, "What is wrong with me?" you begin to ask, "What am I dealing with here? Is this wisdom speaking to me or wounded ego? Is this honest feedback or unconscious projection? Is this a real problem I should examine, or someone else's disorder spilling into my life?" Those questions create freedom, and freedom changes everything. Because once you see clearly, you stop giving every voice equal authority in your mind. You stop treating every criticism as sacred. You stop assuming every conflict means you need to shrink, fix, explain, or defend. You become more selective, more grounded, more deliberate. And that is not arrogance, it is maturity. But there is an even deeper truth here, one that almost nobody talks about. The first law of human stupidity is not only about protecting yourself from foolish people, it is also about freeing yourself from the fantasy that the world will always reward what is good, intelligent, or sincere. That fantasy breaks a lot of people. It breaks people with integrity because they assume effort will always be recognized. It breaks thoughtful people because they assume truth will always be welcomed. It breaks kind people because they assume goodness will always be met with gratitude. But life does not work that way. Not always. Sometimes nonsense gets attention. Sometimes shallowness gets applause. Sometimes irresponsibility rises faster than wisdom, and if you do not make peace with that reality, you will become disillusioned every time the world fails to reflect your values back to you. The deeper strength is this: to remain anchored in truth, even when truth is not trending. To remain thoughtful in a culture of speed. To remain sincere in a world that often rewards performance over substance. To remain awake even when distraction is the social norm. That kind of strength is rare. And it is deeply spiritual, because at some point this conversation stops being about intelligence in the ordinary sense. It becomes a conversation about consciousness, about presence, about whether you are living from awareness or from automatic reaction. Whether you are choosing your life deliberately or simply echoing the noise around you. That is the real dividing line. Not between educated and uneducated, not between successful and unsuccessful, not between polished and unpolished, but between those who are awake and those who are sleepwalking through their own consequences. And perhaps the most shocking revelation of all is this: stupidity is not a fixed identity possessed by a few unfortunate people. It is a permanent human possibility. It appears whenever awareness falls asleep, whenever ego becomes louder than truth, whenever reaction outruns reflection, whenever certainty replaces curiosity, whenever pride blocks learning. That means the battle is not just out there, it is in here too. Every single day, you are either becoming more conscious or more automatic, more reflective or more reactive, more humble, or more trapped inside your own unexamined patterns. That is why this message matters, because it is not only asking you to be more careful about who you trust, it is asking you to become the kind of person who no longer contributes unconsciously to the chaos of the world. And that is a noble calling. So maybe the real lesson is this: do not just fear evil, fear unconsciousness. Fear the life you can destroy while believing you are right. Fear the damage ego can do when it is left unexamined. Fear the version of yourself that stops questioning, stops listening, stops growing, and starts confusing noise with truth. But do not let that fear turn you bitter. Let it turn you awake. Let it make you slower to judge and quicker to observe. Let it make you more careful with your words, more honest with your motives, more intentional with your energy. Let it make you value depth over performance, wisdom over appearance, and clarity over emotional noise. Because in the end, the first law of human stupidity leaves us with a lesson that is both sobering and liberating. It is not enough to be a good person. You must also be a conscious one. It is not enough to mean well. You must see clearly. It is not enough to want peace. You must learn to recognize what destroys it. And once you do, life changes. You stop wasting years trying to explain yourself to minds committed to misunderstanding. You stop handing your peace to people who have not earned access to it. You stop expecting maturity from those who are still ruled by impulse. And perhaps most importantly, you stop underestimating the power of unconsciousness, both in others and in yourself. So remember this, because it may be one of the most important truths you ever hear. The greatest danger of human stupidity is not that it exists. It is that we keep pretending it is harmless. The moment you stop pretending, you begin to see clearly. And the moment you see clearly, you begin to live differently. If this message spoke to you, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling me which part hit you the hardest. And share this with someone who needs to hear it, because sometimes one honest idea, heard at the right moment, can save someone from years of wasted energy.